A few months ago, James reviewed the Alphacool Eisbaer Aurora 360 CPU cooler. Today I have the Alphacool Eisbaer Pro Aurora 360. Pro is the significant part. This cooler ditches the legacy support for LGA 775 and AMD FM2 and stuff like that, and it moves up the scale to the current AM4, but also adds in Xeon and Threadripper support. This is the cooler for big boys, and it's only slightly more expensive than the standard Aurora. This is a fraction under £170. The cooler James reviewed is £150. So in the great scheme of things, there's no cost difference to really worry about. We've got all the features such as 5V RGB, and we have a bigger block to look forward to. Unboxing time. Let's see what we get, and then I'll install the system and we'll do some testing. Instructions. 2 fans, 3 fans, a lot. Installation kits weigh quite a bit. And the cooler assembly. In essence, what we're looking at is an upmarket Asetek type cooler, quite bluntly. We've got a radiator, however it's a copper radiator. We've got a substantial pump and heatsink assembly. 3 120 fans with RGB connections. RGB fan splitter, thermal compound. Oh, one very long bag. That's a driver for plugs, although the access there is somewhat tight. Do we have plugs anywhere else on the rad? We do not. It's a conventional ST type radiator. So Intel Xeon's Various and also high-end desktop, who uses 2011-2066 these days, AM4 Threadripper. Actually, it all looks quite straightforward. The main differences then between the Alphacool hardware and Asetek is copper rad. We've got a quick break there, so if you want to expand the Eisbaer to an Eiswolf graphics setup, such as this, which I shall be doing. Here I have my RTX 3080 with an Alphacool block installed. I'm going to install the Eiswolf setup in a few days' time and then expand this loop to cover both CPU and GPU. But for today, it's the Eisbaer and CPU cooling alone. To put some context on the cold plate of this Pro setup, if I take this Ryzen 7 and put it on the cold plate, little bit of overkill now. So you can see that while you could use this setup on an AM4, it'd be a bit peculiar. Clearly it's intended for Threadripper and Xeon, or if you must, high-end desktop Intel. Yeah, I am king. For our test setup, we're using this Asus ROG Zenith Extreme X399 Threadripper motherboard. The processor is an AMD Ryzen Threadripper 2990X. That's the 32-core model from the 2nd gen. It's rated at 250 watts TDP. SSD is a 1TB WD Black SN850. Memory is 32 gigabytes of G.Skill FlareX rated at 3200 megatransfers. Graphics card is a Sapphire Radeon RX 6800 XT. Power supply, Seasonic Prime Platinum 1300 watts. Do you fancy seeing my noctuas? Hit the bell button, like and subscribe, and I guarantee it'll happen. The first cooler on the test bench for comparative purposes is this Fractal Design Celsius S36, so 360mm Asetek 5th generation. No particular bells and whistles. You can buy these coolers for anything from £115 down to £99 these days. As 360mm coolers go, this is tried and true, and it's also pretty blooming cheap. Thermal compound is Arctic MX5. It's a Threadripper, so we need plenty. After I've done the other coolers, Arctic, I might need another tube. Ready for action. We're in the BIOS about to get testing with the Celsius S36. Bit of housekeeping, I've got the 3 fans connected directly to the motherboard rather than to the little hub on the top of the radiator. So the fans are all connected to the CPU fan connection. Got a manual curve set up, so when it hits 40 degrees Celsius, then the fan speed is going to ramp up to 100%, which should be 2000 RPM. Below that, the fans are ticking over, but obviously a Threadripper will hit 40 very easily. At present, if we go back into monitoring, so fan speed 1950, nominal 2000, and H amp is the pump 2400, and that popped up to 2800 a moment ago. So once we get going, we expect the pump to be running around the 2500 to 3000 RPM, and the fan should be 2000 without any difficulty. And if we go into Extreme Tweaker, the CPU is on auto with XMP enabled, so that's 250 watts, 3.1 gigahertz all cores. Cinebench R23 runs for 10 minutes before it gives a final test run. So temperatures will sort themselves out quite nicely in that time. We can see 2 temperature figures for CPU. We've got TCLT, which is about 80 degrees Celsius, and we've got TDI, which is 52.9. The higher figure is complete nonsense. This is this AMD offset of 27 degrees, which makes no sense to any of us. We ignore TCLT. We look at TDI. TDI is currently just about 53 degrees, which is about what we expect to see. CPU package is 250 watts, 249 watts. Clock speed 3.15 gigahertz. This is all absolutely lovely. Ambient 26. We're having a stinking hot week of it here in the UK at the moment. Same temperatures as Greece. And let us see, there we go. So CPU fans currently running at 2002 RPM. My lord, that's accurate. And the pump is just about 2900. So that's all good. So let it run for 10 minutes. We'll get a figure out of Cinebench R23. We will see what temperatures are doing. Remember, TDI, not the other nonsensical TCLT. Ambient temperature has drifted up by half a degree during this test run, so we're up to 26.7 now. The TDI is 56 degrees, 57 degrees, and we're getting close to the actual benchmark run. Okay, let's just reset the clocks so we get the average temp during the run. .6. It's time to ramp up the performance. And we are enabling PBO. That allows a board limit of a nominal 350 watts in this instance, which works out in practice to 320 watts. The alternative is to go manual, where you punch in numbers yourself. We're just letting the system sort itself out. With PBO enabled, the CPU is now drawing about 320 watts under load, which means it'll run at 3.35 gigahertz, 200 megahertz faster than a previous, which frankly is not a huge amount of extra clock speed when you consider that's an extra 70 or so watts. In fact, it's blooming inefficient. Significant thing here is that TDI is now 68 odd degrees, but the ludicrously reported TCLT figure, which is plus 27, is 94.5. you can imagine that within the CPU alarm bells start to ring when you see huge numbers like 95 or 100. So even though the true temperature is down at 67.5, somewhere in the system it's saying, I'm approaching 100. Also worth noting, ambient is just about to hit 29 because it's blooming hot here. So the ambient is higher than it has been earlier. We have to allow a couple of degrees for that. We'll see how we get on with Cinebench R23 after we've had our 10-minute warm-up and then the actual test itself. As we come to the end of the test run, the T-die is almost exactly 10 degrees hotter than it was before at 68.3. We've got to allow 3 degrees increase in ambient, so 7 degrees hotter for an extra 70 watts. Right, we're done with the Fractal. Let's pull off this cooler and we'll move up to the MSI Core Liquid K360, which is an Asetek 7th gen. Much more expensive, but first let's see how the TIM spread under the Fractal cold plate. Well, that's what happens when you have a relatively tiny cold plate, regular cold plate, on an enormous processor. The TIM just squidges out and you've got 2/3 coverage, perhaps. This is the MSI Core Liquid K360 cooler I used for the launch of Intel's 11th gen Rocket Lake processors. It did a fine job. So Asetek 360 7th gen rather than 5th gen. Significant thing is that the cold plate is the same size, just as you'd expect, because mainstream applications AM4 Intel LGA 115X LGA 1200 rather than the Threadripper. We've got 3-on-20 fans again. These are rated up to 2500 RPM, whereas the Fractal fans got to 2000 RPM. The really big difference with the MSI cooler is it has this downdraft fan for blowing air around the CPU socket, which should help VRMs work very well on the Intel setup. Will be interesting to see whether this cooler behaves pretty much the same as the Fractal, because the limiting factor may well be the cold plate, or whether it's a step forward. But pricing, the Fractal cooler is £115, as I say, you can find it discounted to like 99, 100. This cooler is hugely expensive at 240, it's double the price of the Fractal. Be interesting to see how it performs on Threadripper. As I mentioned, I've previously used this MSI cooler on Intel Rocket Lake, never used it on an AMD platform. Turns out, in addition to the Dragon Center software, you also have to use the Core Liquid app, because the Dragon Center software only, sorry, my mistake, the MSI Center, whoops. The MSI Center software only works on Z590. So you have to first install this MSI app. I don't know whether I then have to install the MSI Center after or not. Well, this is an instance of Leo living and learning. So having installed the Core Liquid app, it now seems I've got everything that I need. So it looks like MSI Center is neither here nor there. And let's bump up the radiator fans to 80%. Oh, look at that. 2000 exactly. Beautiful. Pump fan, CPU fan. I guess by pump fan they mean pump. All set to get testing. The system's been warming up for a couple of minutes. We're seeing a T-die of 61 degrees, ambient 27.8. So between the two runs I did previously with the Fractal. Coming to the end of the warm-up, about to start the run. Ambient has crept up by 3/4 of a degree, just past 28 degrees. T-die 64.5 at the moment. Have to say that's not that impressive. I'm going to ramp up the fan speed to 2500, put the fans on max in other words, and see if that helps out. Think we can agree 2500 RPM is significantly louder than 2000 RPM. We're just about to start the test run after 10 minutes of warm-up. Ambient has crept up by 1 degree since the first run with the MSI, and T-die has also crept up by 1 degree. It's clear that ramping up fan speed by 500 RPM doesn't help cooling at all in this fresh air environment on the bench. It does, however, make the fans quite a lot noisier. The result of the test, however, Cinebench R23 is slightly improved from the first run. Gonna do a third run on the MSI cooler, PBO enabled, so we're at 320 watts nominal. Fans still at 2500 RPM. Ambient temperature 27.7. So this is going to be hot and noisy. Right, the system's been warming up for 5 minutes. CPU package power is 280 watts. Clock speed's in the 3.25 gigahertz area. Okay, we're coming to the end of the 10-minute run. Ambient 28.2. We can see the CPU TCLT is bouncing off 100 and then dropping back. T-die 68.3. Well, we're complete. It's not too exciting. Job done. We're done with Ace Tech. I feel it's my duty to show you the thermal compound on the MSI as I pull it to pieces, and then we'll get on with the Alphacool. Oh yeah. So there we go, loads of thermal compound on the Coldplate. Processor, not so good. Right, let's hope the Alphacool with its huge Pro block does a much better job. Eisbaer Pro Aurora, your time has come. We're what, 20 minutes into this video, which is going to be a review of this. What's come so far has been preparation. I need to assemble this bracket on the block. Oh, we have that at the top. Have that go there, clips together. Hang on, clips together, he says, casually. Snick. Shall I pull? I'll do the peel now. Lest we forget. That's the block. We're going to have to put the fans on the radiator. And for the thread ripper, we have these 4 posts which are similar to LGA 2011 in that they screw into the female threads on the processor frame. Finger tight only. Very specifically says in the instructions, no tools, i.e. don't get your pliers in there. Okay, so fans on rad, thermal compound put together. A quick comparison of the Ace Tech block and the Alphacool block. I mean, there's really no comparison. On with the block, then 4 springs and 4 nuts. Tighten the whole lot down. Remember, no tools, fingers only, and job done. There's quite a lot of cabling for the pump and the fans, and of course we have RGB to contend with as well. It is somewhat messy. Alphacool up and running. So the CPU fans are running at 2280 RPM at the minute, which is curious because I expected to see 2500. The pump 2220. Let us go into Q fan. What's that doing? These fans are rated at 2500 RPM, so don't understand how they can be running 10% faster, but never mind. Let us put a manual profile in where we've got 80% of 40 degrees. Let's pull that down further, 25 degrees for the middle temp, 20 degrees for the lower temp. Here we go, CPU fans, 2860 RPM, which makes no sense at all to me, i.e. very fast. I'm going to have to do another run to pull those fan speeds down because right now they're a lot faster than we've seen so far. Pump is 2400, ambient 26.4, and T-die, it's early days but it's below 50. As we come to the end of the Cinebench warm-up period, ambient has crept up to 27.4, and here we go with the actual test. Okay then, 2,500 RPM fans running at 2,850 RPM is clearly very peculiar. The fans are indeed rated at 2,500 RPM, and there seems to be a PWM compatibility problem with the Asus ROG Zenith motherboard and those fans. I've done some experimentation. I've ended up with the pump connected to the CPU header on the motherboard and the 3 fans connected to this daughter board, which is an accessory with the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme board. So I've got the 3 fans connected to the daughter board. Let us start Cinebench and see whether or not they go up to 2,500 RPM or do something different. These fans, nominally 2,500 RPM, are clearly running plus 10% on 2 of them, and one of them is pretty much 2,500. So perhaps that's the root of the thing. The CPU fan, to reiterate, is actually the pump. Ambient is down at 25.3. Let's run Cinebench, see what happens, and I'm going to pull the fan speed down manually to something much lower just to see whether the CPU cooler can handle Threadripper with lower fan speeds and less noise. We're coming to the end of the warm-up, 1 minute to go. Ambient 25.8 degrees, in the range therefore of what we've had over the past little while. T-die is 53.5. It's going to go up a fraction more, higher so far, 53.8. And the 3 fans, 2,800 RPM, 2,800 RPM, 2,500 RPM. So it would seem the fact the 3 fans aren't doing identical things might have been what was mucking up PWM previously. I'm calling T-die as 53.9. And the score is exactly what we'd expect. We've got the fans now set to silent mode, so they're running at 1,550 RPM. Start Cinebench running, see what happens. Around 2,000 RPM in the first instance, which is a lot quieter. We're about to start the test run after 10 minutes of warm-up. The fans are running at 2,200 RPM, ambient 27.7, T-die 58.6. You will note the ambient has increased by 2 degrees, T-die by 5 degrees. Slowing the fans by 500 RPM has cost 3 degrees delta. Time for the Alphacool with PBO enabled, 320 watts. Cinebench, here we come. CPU package is 317 watts, that's absolutely fine. Processor clock speed 3.3 gigahertz. We're about to start the test run. Ambient is 28.7 and T-die is 67.5, 67.6 degrees, and that's a nice result in Cinebench. Okay, I've got the 3 Alphacool fans removed and they've been replaced with these Noctua Chromax NF F12 PWMs. 1,500 RPM fans, connected in the same way as before to the daughter board, so running for the moment 1428, 1456, 1442. So perhaps slightly slower than 1,500, 1,400 and something RPM, call it 1450. Much quieter. Let's see how we get on in Cinebench. PBO is still enabled, 320 watts of CPU core power. Clock speed is north of 3.3 gigahertz, very nearly 3.4, just as before. Let's see how we get on with clock speed and temperatures. We're coming to the end of the warm-up period. Clock speed's been maintained at 4.3 gigahertz. T-die is 67.6 degrees C. So those Noctuas appear to have done the business. Ambient 28.5, Cinebench complete. Over the past 25 minutes of video, I got somewhat wrapped up with the process of testing the Monster 32-core Threadripper processor. So let's put the temperature chart back up on the screen and take a look. Because the fact of the matter is the Eisbaer Pro 360 cools rather well. It tops the charts at 250 watts and it tops the chart again with PBO enabled at 320 watts. It does a good job. However, it does not leave those 2 Asetek coolers standing, and that was a real surprise to me. Also, that business with PWM control, Another surprise. I thought it was going to be plug and play and would behave itself. I've had a number of words with Alphacool during the course of making this video about the fan control. Their position is quite straightforward. They're saying that their fans on the test bench work correctly. With a proper PWM controller, no trouble whatsoever. The snag is, however, various motherboard manufacturers don't do a particularly good job with PWM control. I can see their point. I think they might even be correct, but the fact of the matter is I'm plugging my fans into a motherboard. It's not a hypothetical exercise, so if they don't work properly in the real world, as the MSI and Fractal fans did, that's a problem. So they've chosen to have their fans connect directly to a three-way splitter and then to a motherboard. They need to work. MSI has gone with USB control, which works absolutely fine, and Fractal's gone with PWM or auto control, which also works fine. On this motherboard, with the Alphacool fans, I hit a problem. Also, I haven't mentioned the RGB, but in passing, it works perfectly well. It's ARGB. There we go. Nice. So, what do I think of the Eisbaer Pro 360? It has a couple of issues. So obviously the PWM control on this motherboard is an issue. It's entirely possible other motherboards it'll just work. But the block, I also have a question mark over it because it's a big block, but it's a general purpose block. This is not a Threadripper cooler because it fits a number of different Intel applications and also surprisingly AM4, but not Intel desktop. And we know Luke has done this many times. If you test on different Threadrippers, including the current Ryzen 3000s, and we're not yet sure what's going to happen with the Ryzen 5000 Threadrippers, you want a specific cooler for specific configurations of core complexes and chiplets. Another big surprise to me in the course of this review was the noise level of the Alphacool fans at full blast, and how well the Noctuas that I used for comparison did when they were running considerably slower and much quieter. In terms of performance, there was very little to choose between them, which goes to show you don't have to have raughty loud fans to get decent performance. These fans are, I've had PWM issues and they are noisy. Fact. However, the Alphacool is not particularly expensive. It's £170, £20 more than the non-Pro. It does a competent job. So, are you in the market for a fairly cheap 360 cooler that you can expand to integrate into your graphics loop should you choose, on some version of Xeon or a Threadripper? Personally, I'm not. The way I see it is if I'm spending £1,000 or £2,000 on a CPU, and I personally have used Threadripper 1000s, I'm now on Threadripper 2000s, and I'm going to be looking at the Threadripper 5000s when they come out, but will probably move to Threadripper 3000, i.e. buy a decent processor from the family that's about to go end of life, because generally speaking they're discounted quite heavily. Would I buy this cooler over my preferred cooling hardware? Probably not. And the reason is because I'm spending a blessed fortune on motherboard, memory, processor, graphics and all the rest of it. Saving 20 quid or 50 quid on the cooler, it's not really a big deal to me. I'm in for a load of money. As a percentage, another £50 or £100 on a cooler that looks the part or delivers extra performance or is nice and quiet, I'll go for it every time. And I have done with Threadripper. As for Intel high-end desktop, Intel Xeon, couldn't care less about them at the moment. That might change, but right now I do not care. The idea of using this Pro cooler on AM4 strikes me as daft. So pros and cons. Solid design and engineering. No argument there. I think these parts are going to last a decent length of time, unlike certain coolers that you think, they maybe got a year, possibly two. Cooling, it's okay. Decent performance. ARGB, yep. Absolutely fine. Doesn't cost a lot. You get a lot of hardware for your money. You can expand the loop to add a GPU Eiswolf cooler from Alphacool, and I'll be doing that quite soon. I've done it before for Kit Guru. I'll be doing it again in the very near future. On the cons side, I suffered PWM problems. That might not be an issue for you. It was in this instance, as you saw. Fans are too noisy. They just are. CPU block is general purpose and non-specific. In other words, you can buy a better block for very specific cooling applications. If you want a big block that does grunt work, this does fine. And finally, the fan cables for lighting and PWM control, they can get untidy. There's a lot of cabling and it needs some attention. Overall, it's worth considering. It's not a failure, not by a long chalk, but there is certainly room for improvement. Be sure to check back soon. I'm going to use this hardware and the Eiswolf graphics cooler in a build. And I'm going to use the Corsair 7000 case that was absolutely made for that particular job.